Hey everyone, today we are joined by a star of professional wrestling. He's been involved in the industry for around 20 years now, known for his time in various promotions, including Full Impact Pro, Ring of Honor Wrestling, Evolve Wrestling, Dragon Gate USA, and beyond. Fans may best know him for his time in the Dark City Fight Club. Jon, sir, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem, man. How you doing?
I am doing great. I'm doing even better now that I get to talk to you. You know, Dark City Fight Club was so much fun for me when you guys really started kicking it off in Ring of Honor. I was probably 17, 18, something like that. So like it was right in like the real meaty part of my fandom. So it was such an exciting time. But before we get to your incredible career, I like to hit the plugs early on. And then once we hit the plugs, I want to talk about one specific thing, which is really exciting that you just started up. So, but where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter, Jon Davis 817, and I'm on Instagram. Just got back on that dude, Jon Davis.
As a reminder, guys, we do have links in the description to his social media and, of course, the next thing I'm about to mention. So please make sure to show some support. People are nice enough to come onto the show, offer their time to talk about their career and their path in wrestling and entertain everybody. So please show some support back to them. Now, here's the big thing I want to talk about: Hatchet Pro Wrestling. We just talked to Tom Latimer maybe a week ago, maybe a little longer, and it's such an exciting time for wrestling. There's so much going on, and the fact that three incredible trainers are getting together to do this is very exciting. So, could you talk about it, please?
So, Hatchet was born out of almost necessity. Dexter Loomis and I both come from the Jacksonville, North Florida area, and there are schools around here, but they're your run of the mill indie wrestling school. You got a couple guys or a guy, and he just kind of wants to teach you moves and then kind of send you on your way. And Dexter and I have been talking for years about this. Like we came up together. So uh, we finally got everything moving, and our focus isn't to just teach you moves, just to teach you the whys and the hows and the different approaches and aspects to it. We want to teach you the business. I tell the kids it's the pro wrestling business. So you need to understand the business side, clearly the wrestling side, and also the professional side. So there's a lot that goes into it. We They have homework. They all get notebooks. So I will send them out an assignment, and they have to come back and we go over it. And there's not necessarily wrong answers per se, but it's just discussion because I want to get their brains moving. And it's really easy. And I'm sure you've seen it before when somebody debuts and they're brand new or they're just out of academy somewhere. Uh, it's kind of like going through the motions. They do what they learn in training, and that's kind of it, right?
Yeah.
And we want them to be complete when they come out. We want them to understand listening to the crowd. We want them to understand selling. We want them to understand psychology. And it's not everybody is going to catch on as fast as other people. That's a very obvious thing, but we want to be able to afford these guys coming up opportunities that we weren't. And I'm sure that most of the people that you've talked to when they started, it was just a ring and getting beat up
Yeah.
pretty much. And then
Yep.
that's how I came in. That's how it kind of goes unless you have some trainer that was farther along and had a bigger grasp on it. And we want to be able to give these kids everything they need to be as successful as possible. I abide by the philosophy to actually leave it better than you found it. And one I borrowed from Adam Pearce: work hard, treat people fairly, and earn respect. And I feel like they go hand in hand. So we want to start teaching that from day one in this school. You're not going to come in. It's like, oh, well, we're going to teach you body slams today. First day you have to earn getting into the ring, and we tell them that, look, you get here, thank you for coming, and we're excited for you, but you're going to show us that you want to be in this ring, and then we run them into the ground. And then when they don't think they have anything left, okay, wipe your feet, get in, and that's how we start. But it's it's a very big deal to both myself and Dexter and Tom. Tom's been around a while, and he has seen a lot of things, and he's had, much like everybody, ups and downs, but he's overcome, and he is an underrated mind in
Mhm.
wrestling, in my opinion. I met him years ago and thought, okay, well, this guy has everything. He's got the look, he's got the gravelly British accent, which I'm sure the ladies like, and like total package in the ring too. Like he's smart with his wrestling, and everything just kind of comes in like it should. And Dexter is self-explanatory. And but we all come from the same mindset. We all kind of think the same. So we have different ways to get to the same point, but we're all going to the same point. And that's what we're trying to pass along to these kids. I know that's a long answer, but I'm kind of passionate.
No, that's exactly what we're looking for, and I appreciate that. I'm going to touch on it just a little more, actually, because I'm curious about something. You mentioned, of course, Dexter Loomis and Tom Latimer, who are the co-trainers of the academy. Can you talk a little bit about them, your relationship with them, and just what you think about them as performers in general? Because I know you just touched on it a little bit, but could you go a little more in detail about both men?
So I'll start with Tom. So I met Tom fresh out of FCW NXT, and he was just this jacked. I call him British Conan. He just was this big, like barbarian looking dude, and he was super cool in the locker room. And like, you have people to get a little bit of experience, and maybe it doesn't work out in whatever big that they're in. They come back down to the indies, and they're holding a grudge against the independents, like it's our fault that something didn't work out, right? But he understood that the business is business. He understood that perhaps it wasn't his time for that particular company. And we just instantly hit it off. He was friends with the guy that used to wrestle on the Indies, Tommy Taylor, who was also an FCW guy. And Tommy put him over to me, and we just got to chopping it up. And we started realizing that we kind of think the same on stuff, and we'd stand back and we'd watch a match together, and we'd have the same thought process. But at the end of the day, he was a down to earth guy. He didn't hold himself in a higher regard than anybody standing around him, which is big for me. I don't do good with egos. It's never been a thing that I'm able to hide my disdain for, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So being humble is a talent in our profession at times. But he was humble. He wanted to help. He wanted to see other guys do good. And that just kind of what solidified our relationship. As far as Dexter goes, we met when he was going under a different moniker, and I saw a couple different iterations of him. And he was one of those guys that was ultra talented, and he didn't look like he belonged on the shows that he was doing. And that's no disrespect to the shows or the talent there, but he's always looked like he looks now physically.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a time where he was actually bigger, like as far as muscle goes.
Oh, wow.
So you'd have a guy come out there and he'd be standing in the ring, and then Dexter would come out and everybody, oh, okay, there's about to be a murder. So he just had this presence about him. And it was crazy to me that he wasn't signed a long, long time ago. And I've told him that before. Like, I don't get how you're not a millionaire. And I've watched him evolve from his off the wall character to the early iteration of Dexter Loomis that we saw in other companies, and now the one that you have now. And he gets it. I mean, if you think about it, one of the biggest reactions in NXT was him just saying one word.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember seeing it and getting goosebumps, and I immediately texted him. He wasn't even out of the segment yet. And I was texting him. I was like, this is amazing. And I always put that over to people. It's like, if you get what you're doing and you understand it, then the smallest things mean the most. And but anyway, professionally, I don't think I could have any more respect for him. I get surprised here and there listening to him coach, because we've never all coached around each other before.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say something and I'll find myself being a student because I'm a fan of their work. So it's kind of hand in hand. So they'll start coaching and I'll listen. Okay, this is all right. I like the way that they're saying this. Or like, I like their reasoning. I like their whys. But as people, man, they're just two good dudes. Legitimately, they'll give you the shirt off their back. And if they can see that you're passionate, they'll do anything that they can to help you. And that's kind of what brings us all together.
That's super cool. Thank you for that, guys. Again, check out Hatchet Pro Wrestling. We have links in the description of every video, both the full interview and the individual clips. So be sure to show some support. If you're interested in training, reach out. I'm sure you guys have a contact page on the website. I can't remember exact setup, but there's a way to reach out. And there's also Instagram and X, Twitter. I hate calling it X. And we'll have that in the description too. So
Yeah.
one name you mentioned, who again, this is a little out of the time I had planned, but you mentioned Adam Pearce, and Adam Pearce has been a channel favorite. He's somebody who I saw. We probably have a dozen videos on him of different people talking to him. He's just someone everybody loves to talk about. Could you talk about Adam Pearce a little bit in your relationship with him?
So Adam Pearce is almost solely responsible for the Dark City Fight Club success in Ring of Honor.
Wow.
Uh, we were working Florida Indies and we were traveling around here and there, and we knew we were a good team. We were still a relatively new team. We'd been teaming for a little over a year by the time we hit Ring of Honor. And we were just looking for an opportunity. And, independence, it's hard with tag teams in the South sometimes, especially at that time. And we go to Ring of Honor, and our tryout match was this team you may have heard of called Stenerico, Kevin Steen and El Generico.
Who'd they ever beat? Where'd they ever go?
Yeah, exactly. Right there. I think they're just local guys, and I think they're still working somewhere. But that was our first match, and we went out there and I tore it down. I mean, it was their introduction to us, and we didn't wrestle like we were trying out. We wrestled like we had a job. We wrestled like we belonged. We wrestled like pro wrestlers. But anyway, we get through that, and the next night it was myself and Corey and one of my mentors, Frank Chiazzo, who actually just recently passed. But it was us versus Brent Albright, Eric Stevens, and Roderick Strong. And we get through that match and we get a great reaction, and we get to the back and Pearce grabs us. He's like, "Hey, you guys got jobs. I don't know the details yet, but you have jobs." And that's exactly
cool.
what he told us. That was the second day that I knew him.
Wow.
And so he got us up there, and then they started bringing us in, and then he kind of looked over our deal as far as what was being offered to us. And him and Austin Aries actually were not happy with the way they were structured. So they restructured them unbeknownst to us, for us, and got us more money and better accommodations on the back end. And but Adam Pearce is one of the he's a journeyman. Like, he's done everything, and he's wrestled everybody, and he knows everybody, and nobody really has a bad thing to say about him. He like I said, he looked out for me before he even really knew me. He knew what kind of wrestler I was, and he knew like I was one of the boys, but he did that for me just because he cares that much about the business and that the boys being happy and getting what they deserved, even just starting out there. And but he's had all these experiences, and he's probably legitimately in my top 3 NWA World Champions of all time.
That's crazy.
Just,
really cool.
I mean, think about it. Think about the way that he carried the championship. Think about the way that he carried himself, his promos, his matches. He didn't wrestle the same kind of guy every show. It's not the same NWA that you have now. This one was much different. He did a lot more traveling. He was all over the country, all over the world, actually. And he's having matches with everybody. And it's all different talent levels, all different levels of actual stardom, because he was wrestling big names for that time. And he did it with dignity. And you never, like, every time you saw him, you felt like you were watching a pro wrestler. He gave me Harley Race vibes, not in the sense with the, with that fro and anything, because, Pearce and hair, but he did it with, like, he spoke with conviction. And if he said he was going to punch you in your face, you knew you were going to get punched in the face. And that's one of the things that endeared me to wrestling in the first place. So in Adam Pearce, I saw a lot of my heroes growing up, like guys that I watched on television and wanted to emulate when I got into the business, or as a child thinking about it, wrestling around with your friends in the yard. But moreover, him as a person, like, I can reach out to him right now and text him, and he will respond to me. I mean, if he's busy, whatever, but he'll respond to me the instant he gets an opportunity. I've never gone a day and had to wait 24 hours for him to text me back. And He's always got advice for me if I need it. He's always he's always got a good in the middle look on things. He doesn't get jaded by stuff because I watched him get passed over by TNA and I was angry and he told him they were foolish to pass on him, but he understood and instead of being jaded, he learned from it and he took away from it and he made himself better. And there's not a lot of humans like that. Uh, they're not going to take the bad and learn from it consistently. And Pearce has hit home runs everywhere he's gone, and it was crazy that they didn't sign him when they did. But I think things worked out for him,
Yeah,
and
to
he's
say the
in a
least.
better spot now. But like I would consider him one of a good friend of mine, and one of the people who didn't have to look out for me when he did, and I'll forever be indebted to him for that. So that's my thing on Pearce. Oh,
That's
and I watched him duct tape Sawanaro's entire upper body and then take him to Wawa in Philly once. But
We
that's
need to
another
talk
thing.
about this, please, because Sal has brought that story. Sal's been on the channel 4 times now. Sal brought up the story, but he can't remember why it happened, how it happened. He just has a picture of himself covered, like wrapped up in duct tape and like Adam Pearce's phone, and he was so confused by it. Do you know the story?
So we were in Philly, we were at the arena, and we were doing TV, and they were in one of the side rooms, and there was a desk in there, and they were sitting at the desk, and it was Pearce, Cabana, Sal, and people were walking in and out, and Pearce found duct tape somewhere. I don't even know where he got it from, but Sal just sitting at the table because I remember I was standing there and I hear the duct tape and I look and Sal doesn't even turn and look at Pearce. Pearce just starts duct taping him. And he goes all around his upper body and his shoulder and one of his arms or whatever. And Sal never ever sells it. And he gets finished. He goes, "Hey, you guys want to go to Wawa?" He goes, "Yeah, let's go." And they just all left and went to Wawa. There was no reason that it happened. There was nothing behind it. Pearce was just bored and he just started taping up Sal and Sal just kind of went with it. Team player, I guess.
That honestly sums Sal up from my experiences too. He's just like, okay, let's roll with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
That's just he was good.
your point on Adam Pearce is super interesting because I don't know him personally, but the experiences I've had with him, he's always been extremely supportive of the channel when he has no reason to be. You know where he is, and it's not like you know, it's not like I can really necessarily help him, but he's just always been super kind to me for, again, no real reason, just to be a good guy. So I definitely can see where you're coming from there. But I do want to talk about your career. Let's start from the very beginning, even before you ever stepped foot in the ring. When did you first see pro wrestling? What made you a fan?
Whew. So I was a kid. I was living with my grandparents in Georgia, and my grandfather was a giant pro wrestling fan. And it was on Sundays, but he was a preacher, so we had to get out of church, drive an hour home, turn on the TV to catch the National Wrestling Alliance. It was before they turned it to WCW. That's how old I am. And I remember we had this giant wooden TV, and my grandmother wouldn't let us eat in the kitchen or in the living room. And myself and my grandfather were both afraid of my grandmother because she was much meaner than either one of us ever could be. But I would push the TV to where I could turn it and we could sit at the table and watch it. And my earliest memories are watching um, a young Luger, a very young Sting, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the that sticks in my mind probably the Horsemen starting to look for other people outside of Ole, and but I mean they had the green ring skirting with the blue NWA on the side that wasn't the best choice of colors, but it worked for them. And they were shooting their TVs out of the Coliseums in the Carolinas and things like that. So there was no padding or anything around it or whatever. But I was just it pulled me in because of the way they carried themselves. Uh, Everybody had names that sounded like actual names. There was no uh, crazy names as of yet that I remember. I mean, but the the way that they did everything felt like everything was on the line in every match. And it just kind of pulled me in right away. And I just remember that being a thing. I was either watching football or watching wrestling. And my grandparents weren't big into sports, so I'd only see football at my friends' houses. But there was just that appeal, that draw to wrestling, just how they told the stories and how these people were reacting. And the '80s is a different time than now, but watching people trying to swing something at Flair or Arn, or like the way they reacted for the Rock and Roll Express, that reaction back then was insane. Like it was like Dusty, Rock and Roll Express, Sting, and then everybody else. Like it was like a very big difference. And then Magnum TA eventually, but uh just the way those characters came through the screen to me, it is calling me, basically, for lack of a better term and a corny description. But uh I just got hooked, and then I just kind of followed along with them as it went, and then it just continued to grow from there.
I'm curious about something because obviously the '80s had the massive national expansion of the then WWF, and there's a WWF, especially in the, I would say, late '80s and then throughout the middle '90s, was much different to WCW. It was much more cartoony. WCW eventually started doing a lot of that. I think it was his Jim Herd era, but when it was the NWA in the early days of the WCW, it was very, I won't say sports based, but by comparison, it certainly was. Were you more gravitated towards one? Did you ever become a WWF guy, or were you always like, no, Crockett, NWA, WCW, that's my thing?
So I moved to Philly, and I was a kid, and WCW really wasn't on.
Mhm.
And I found wrestling. It was WWF. I believe it was a build up for WrestleMania 3, Hercules Hernandez and Billy Jack Haynes. And Hercules out there cutting a promo. And I remember turning on the TV and seeing him. I'm like, okay, that's a big guy. And then Billy Jack came out and they started attacking each other because they were fighting over the full Nelson, whose move it was. And I knew Billy Jack. So Billy Jack Haynes was the reason I didn't turn the channel from WWF.
All right.
And so I would watch WWF, and I wasn't huge on it at the time, just because I've been so NWA. And even during the Attitude Era, I was a Nitro guy, and I'd watch the undercard of WCW is what hooked me, because it was very similar to, it was just an evolution from what the old NWA was. They were just wrestlers, and they were just out there like trying to perfect and hone their craft. And they were lucky enough to do so in front of all those people. And it's not a knock against WWF, because there were characters that I gravitated to or that I really liked to watch, and it just didn't feel as realistic to
Mhm.
me. And if you've ever watched one of my matches, it's I'm very much along the, okay, let's try to make this realistic and seem like a fight than over the top cartoon stuff.
I think in general in that era, a lot of the common opinion is both among fans and from people I've talked to in the business. You know, WCW had the better undercard, and the
Mm-hmm.
WWF had the more exciting and better action in the main event, right? So you had the
Absolutely.
Benoits, the Rays, but then you had the Austins, the Bretts, the Shawns. So it was interesting how the balance was different, right? You had your undercard guys in WWF, who of course really now we know are great in their own way, but they weren't the wrestlers that WCW had or in the main event. And then in WCW, you had the incredible physical styles of the undercard, and then the main event, you had the stars.
Yep. And that was one of the big things. It's like I didn't like the Attitude Era was good in the sense that it was different business than what anybody had ever seen before. But like if I wanted to see a girl in a bikini, I'd just go to the beach. So
Yeah.
that didn't appeal to me like it did to a lot of people. And um again, they both did huge numbers and they did giant business. And I think the competition was, the fans won more than anybody else. But it's just, I don't know. I've always liked the feeling of it actually being a fight, and I like feeling like I'm not watching a character. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
it's like I could get into Brad Armstrong easier than I could get into Max Moon.
Yeah.
And not that Max Moon wasn't cool, it was this comic book thing, but I prefer just the classic style, I guess, the Southern classic style, I guess you could say, over the cartoony stuff.
No, that makes sense. And your point on the whole bikini situation was very, very accurate. And I know as a fan personally, I'm so glad the route women's wrestling is taken compared to what it used to be and the way that it was treated. Because now, some of the biggest stars in wrestling are, what Camille, right there. Who knows where she's going? Obviously, I'm not going to ask about that. But the fact that she's one of the hottest free agents in the world, you couldn't really say that back in 1998, 1999. You know what I mean? Maybe,
And
I guess when Sable left, maybe, but it was
absolutely
different.
not. And that's the thing. Like, you could take Camille and you could plug her in anywhere, and
Mhm.
she's going to fit, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to argue that WWE's women's roster right now is probably the most stacked that it's ever been
Yeah.
from top to bottom.
It's crazy.
Um, AEW's women's roster is they're super talented. They're all super hungry.
Yeah.
I just think the promotion for them could be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because I don't see them and the WWE women in the same way. Not that one's better than the other, but
Presentation wise, it's different.
exactly. And I think Jade leaving AEW kind of hurt him because she had that mega star vibe to her,
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the way that she carried herself. And Camille, I think, is you plug right in that spot.
Yeah.
She's a super athlete, and she's got a look about her. She's got a presence about her. And I don't say they carry themselves the same way because I don't feel like they do, but there's definitely like you see them, you're like, okay, who's that? And she came up with a athletic background just like Jay did, and she's got to her advantage the experience, and she's been all over the world, and she was a world champion, and she's just got that pedigree. So I feel like that it'll be interesting to see where she lands. But I think that I much prefer the way that the women are treated now than the way that they were then. And like my favorite women's wrestlers of all time. Well, I don't say all time, but when I was a kid, I remember seeing the Jumping Bomb Angels, and it blew
Yeah.
my mind because
Incredible.
nobody was like them, especially in America, right? But that's kind of got my focus on to paying attention to the women. But like, I mean, if you just talk about their impact, let's just talk about the Royal Rumble for a second.
Yeah.
You're watching that, and the men's story was already told. Everybody knew it was going to be pretty much one or two people, barring some giant surprise. And the women's rumble was open. Like, you didn't know for sure who was going to do what. And to even go further, when Naomi shows back up, like, that reaction was huge, right? And then Jordan Grace comes out.
Yeah.
She gets a big reaction, and she's not even a WWE person, right? And she comes out there and they hug, and everybody knew that story already. And there was a big reaction. And then they just started blasting each other. And I remember it getting my attention because, one, Jordan's not the tallest woman to wrestle, but she fit in that ring. She belonged there.
Yeah, for sure.
And I was surprised how comfortable she looked, how she didn't look like she never got lost in the moment. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy for a lot of these women that aren't full timers, like how they used to bring girls back for Royal Rumbles. They would get lost for a minute, and that never happened with George. She was business the entire time, and to me, that was probably the most impressive part of the Women's Rumble. But she even down to elimination, but the whole way through the Rumble was like, okay, this could go anywhere. And that's a big step for women's wrestling. And I never honestly thought that I'd be going on this long of a rant about women's wrestling. But
I know, but it's
yeah,
true. It's accurate.
you got me thinking about it. But like the women now have something to be proud of, and I think they say there was a women's revolution a few years back, but I think that what's on the horizon is going to be more exciting than what's in the rear view.
Super cool. Thank you for that insight. I very much appreciate it. As far as your favorites go, you mentioned some of the names, but who were your favorites growing up, and how did they influence you later on?
Um, Bret Hart, Arn Anderson, Regal, just those rough and tumble kind of guys.
Yeah.
I like Bret because he wasn't the biggest in the WWF by any stretch of the imagination, but you believed everything that he did, everything. And growing up, I was small, believe it or not. And I remember watching him and Davey Boy, and I told my friend Josh, I was like, "Hey, I'm gonna be a wrestler," and his mom's like, "You'll never be big enough," and it stuck with me. But though I wanted to yell at her, my solace was, okay, Bret's not the biggest guy, so that always kind of stayed in the back of my head, and then I kind of outgrew that thought process. Because if you are hungry and you work hard, then you're going to be hungry and work hard, and you'll get there. It may take a little longer, it may be a different path, but you'll get there. But Bret was just always in WWF. He just stood out to me just because of the way that he carried himself, and he was wearing pink in the '80s, and that was accepted. Like he wasn't like the warrior who was big and super jacked and wore all these bright colors. He wore pink just because of, I mean, obviously because of his namesake, but nobody thought anything about it just because that's how good he was in the ring. You can't deny that.
What's interesting about Bret to me was that, like, you mentioned the size thing. He would be in there with guys like Diesel and The Undertaker. He never felt small, even with guys who dwarfed him, because his wrestling style, he would break them down and he would put them on his level. He'd get them down on the mat. And I think that's the realism maybe that you were talking about earlier, where he felt like a true competitor, where everything he did made sense and it was special.
Exactly. And that's a really good way to say it, because I mean, he had good matches out of Diesel. He got, I mean, helped make X-Pac or 1-2-3 Kid. That's one of the most copied matches, even in recent history, that I've seen. But he just got it. And similar thing with Arn Anderson. He wasn't the main guy, and arguably sometimes he wasn't even he might be sitting number 3 or number 4 in his group.
Yeah.
But he talked and you'd believe him. And all of this stuff, believable, even if he was being over the top with stuff. But he had this thing about him to where it felt like a prize fighter. Like he's there to do a job and he's going to get the job done. Win or losing, he's going to get the job done. He would lose matches and still take his opponent out to set him up for Rick, right? So that just kind of stuck with me. But like he's another guy that just wasn't the biggest guy, but you believed him.
He also made, like, even though he wasn't a main event guy, when he was the television champion, it was like the television title really meant something when it was on Arn because of how Arn presented it.
I had a conversation with somebody and said that if I was to wrestle in the NWA, my goal would be the television championship because of Arn Anderson. Arn Anderson is one of the reasons I have a beard. So I agree with that wholeheartedly because he made it mean something. In the same instance that like Bret and Shawn did with the IC championship, it meant so much more because of the way that they carried it. But that kind of style of work is what pulls me in. Like the same thing with Regal. Regal wasn't the most physically intimidating person, but he did so many things that you appreciated then, and then now with experience, you go back and watch, and you appreciate it even more. When I wrestled Fit Finley a few years back, and I watched him and Regal to get ready for it, and we didn't wrestle anything like that match, but I was watching that, and it just reminded me how big of a fan of Regal I was. And there's if you've ever seen it, have you ever seen the World War III with him in the ring behind the guy doing the introductions?
I am not sure off the top of my head.
If you haven't seen it, seek it out. And this is for anybody paying attention. Regal's standing in the ring, and the guy's doing the introduction to the match. And Regal's looking around, and he's like, he got his little scowl on or whatever. And then he sees a guy, and he kind of gives him a scowl, and he turns and he sees a bigger guy, and he kind of like leans back and turns and sees a bigger guy. So he starts freaking out about all the big men, like the big guys around him. And he's like having like a meltdown, but it's all facial expression. You only see him from the middle of the chest up. So if you haven't seen it, watch it, because he's working right there, and he hasn't even done anything. The match hasn't even started yet, but it's just him selling the size and the different kinds of guys in the ring. It's hilarious, but it's something to pay attention to as a young wrestler.
That's fantastic. I don't remember that specifically, but I'm definitely going to have to go out of my way to look for it because his facial expressions are brilliant.
Yeah, just wait till you see this. It's crazy.
I definitely want to cover that Finley match in the future. Hopefully, if I'm lucky enough to talk to you again for a second interview, hopefully we can cover it then. I want to ask about least favorites now. Now, people can take two different approaches with this. The first is, I didn't like this guy, I didn't enjoy his work. But the approach people normally take is, this guy was such a good heel, he made me hate him. You can take either approach you want, but who were some of your least favorites growing up?
Well, I just told you that Arn, Bret, and Regal were my favorites, and they both played both sides of the ball pretty well.
Yeah.
When it comes to least favorites, it's hard because like I look at it open per se. Like I wasn't okay, this guy's dastardly, so I hate him, because if you did the job good, then I was with you.
All right.
Um,
So you weren't someone who was necessarily like riled up by the heels where you were like getting mad, in your living room.
no, like there would be matches where I'd have one favorite and another favorite, and it would, like, as a kid I would react because this favorite was beating this other guy that I really liked. But I was never like oh man, I hate this guy. As you get into the business, there's things where you're like, oh, okay, well, watching this back, I really don't get this, or oh, I don't like this guy. But typically, for me to dislike you, I have to have a personal reason almost. And I was so into the contest and the sport aspect of it, I never really hated anybody per se.
Were there certain heels that, with the benefit of hindsight, you can look back and say, wow, they were, incredible at their job? Like, obviously, you talked about Regal, you talked about, Bret. In my opinion, 1997 is my favorite era of Bret, when he was the, anti-America heel that was kind of a baby face in certain parts of the world. Like, that to me was great. Regal's obviously incredible. But were there certain, for example, the Midnight Express were just incredible as a tag team? You had Cornette, who was, the loudest, most obnoxious manager in the world. Like, was there someone back then who now you can be like, okay, they were great?
Um, I love the Freebirds.
All right.
I hated the entrance where Hayes would get on the buckle and Jimmy would be on the apron, and they'd do that stupid point at each other. It's one of my biggest points of contention with me and one of my friends, Jake, who runs Pollyanna, and he always puts it over, and I've always hated it. Like, I'll go find something else to do until the match starts. So if I'm watching something out like an old Super Brawl or something, I'll walk away when they do their entrance, and then I'll come back and watch the match when it starts. But Freebirds got heat everywhere they went, and then they could flip over the baby face, especially Michael, and make it a big thing. I loved Terry Gordy. I thought that it sucked that America didn't take him in the same way that Japan did.
Yeah.
Same thing with Hansen. To go back and to look a little rabbit hole thing, there used to be a video called Sam Henson Hates Everything, or Sam Henson Hates Everybody. And he was wrestling the Black Hearts. It's him and Dan Spivey, and it was in Japan. And something happened, and Stan just lost it. And he hits one of them with the corner of the chair, and you can see him bleeding through their mask, and he's just like kicking him in the face. Like, it got ugly really fast. And I'm sure you can find it if you look it up or whatever. But the crowd went from like, okay, this is a bad guy, to like, okay, this is something completely different. Like, he's trying to kill these guys.
Yeah.
So much so that Dan Spivey had to tag in to calm everything down.
That's hilarious knowing the stories with Dan Spivey, hearing them.
Yeah. And the finish is like Stan hit one with a lariat and then he hit the other one. And the other one, the second one, I'm not sure which Blackheart it was, but the second one was asleep. There was no like selling. Like he just put him to bed with a lariat. And but in WCW, he was such a good heel because of how he played that Southern stereotype over the top, but close to the chest, if it makes sense. Like I felt like if you pulled up at any random like rough and tumble bar for that time period, you would run into a guy similar to Stan Hansen, but he would just seem meaner. Like he just seemed mean. So like he always stood out to me as a good heel too.
And what's great about Stan is like, you talked about maybe in the US he didn't quite hit the same peaks as he hit in Japan, but at the same time, like he had that Bruno feud and he had that legendary stuff that went with the broken neck. And so the fact that he did so much in the US and he still didn't, like, that just shows what a star he was in Japan. Like it's crazy if you really think about it.
And he broke Bruno's neck with that ugly dyed blonde hair. That did not fit him at all. But no. I was like, man, like he did that to Bruno and his hair looked like that. Maybe that's why he did it. But
then again, we talked about Bruno's hair a couple of years when he had I don't even want to call it a wig, but whatever it might have been,
Yeah.
Brilliant.
But I was going to piggyback off of Bruno.
Please.
I talked with Larry Zbyszko years ago. I used to bump into him all the time in the gym, of all places. And he talked about meeting Bruno before, like, he put his book out or whatever, but he just talked about how strong and legitimate Bruno was. And he had this picture that he showed me, and it's him and Bruno standing next to each other. And I remember Larry Zbyszko 80s, 90s, but when he was doing the thing with Bruno, he was even like he was a presence physically, like he was a big dude. But he would tell me that Bruno would do upright rows with 315 pounds.
Oh.
And I don't know if you've ever done an upright row, but 315 pounds is a lot.
Not even close to that in my life.
Yeah. So, but it all came from, I was asking Larry why Bruno never manscaped because he was ultra hairy, right? And in our business now, you don't see that a lot. But like Bruno had hair, I mean, it was all over him. But he was like, oh, he didn't have to. Like, who's going to say something? He would just crush their head. And then he kind of went into that, like how legitimately strong and how legitimately talented and how much of a shooter Bruno actually was. And it always threw me off. And it's crazy that we didn't really get a Bruno heel run because that would have been massive.
In the fact, like, it was such a different time. Like I've heard, people talk about how if you went to different territories, it didn't always work because of his style, it was different, but it worked so amazingly well in, the Northeast. And it's just, I think it's hard for people to even because wrestling has changed so much since then. So I think a lot of fans and people in the industry, they have trouble even grasping what a big deal he was at the time because, they don't understand like the Madison Square Garden sellouts over and over and over. And it's crazy. It's crazy.
Well, you got to think too that like back in those times, like there were so many Italians and immigrants in the Northeast. Same thing with Pedro Morales. Like they were both huge, huge draws. Salvatore Bellomo was a giant undercard guy. And he didn't look like he was anything, but the people just gravitated to him because of his heritage. Mm-hmm. And I think that Bruno could have taken the heritage angle and taken that to Texas and started riots.
Wow, yeah.
And I just don't think that he thought about it that way because he was so beloved in the Northeast that it wouldn't have made any sense, honestly, to him as far as money goes. Like, why go to Texas and risk getting stabbed by some elderly lady outside of the arena when you can just stay in the Northeast and make all the money that they could possibly give you?
Yeah, in like the 70s, 80s, I think even in the 60s, it was very much, early 80s, very much ethnicity based because like even Hulk Hogan, like the emphasis at one point was the Irish Hulk Hogan. People kind of forget that because he became the national expansion Hulk Hogan guy. But like when he was first coming into the company, he was like, oh, here's this big Irishman. Like, so it's interesting how that kind of, I guess it evolved because they became national because it wasn't a territory anymore. And I mean, of course, you still had it, but it became more of a heel slant, right? The Iron Sheik, the Nikolai Volkovs, where it wasn't necessarily, well, here's the Puerto Rican for the fans in New York they can love, you know?
Yeah, I
But
agree.
next thing I want to talk about, and this is, I guess, maybe the most influential question of your life. How did you get into wrestling?
So, I had a crazy meeting with a war vet, and it basically, it was random, but it motivated me to start chasing everything that I wanted to do. I was thinking about joining the military, and then I met him, and he just kind of broke his story down to me. And so I remember walking out because I went to see him, and my cousin was there. He had a sprained ankle, so I'd taken him to the emergency room. But I heard him next door, and he had told the nurse, he's like, "Hey, I got some bites. I just want to make sure they're not infected. I can't really feel my arm like that." She goes, "Okay, were they dog bites?" He goes, "No, they're shark bites."
Wow.
And exactly. And I was like, I told my cousins, like, as soon as this nurse walks away, I'm in there. And I mean, like, she walked down, I peeled in right behind her. And then we got to talking, and he told me the story. And by the time he was done with the story, I had tears in my eyes. And he's like, I wouldn't trade anything that I've done for anything. I wouldn't go back and change anything. But what I'm going to tell you is that you should chase your dreams. You don't want to be an old man that says, "Oh man, I probably could have been this," or "I wish I would have done that." It's like, be old with no regrets. And it stuck with me.
Yeah.
So I got back with my cousin. I was like, man, I'm on it. And started doing arena football tryouts. I did a model search before I became ugly. And then found a wrestling card after a tryout one time, and my friend had given it to me, and completely forgotten about it. And at the time, I had a box spring and a mattress. I didn't like the bed frame thing, but I woke up and I rolled over, and I went to grab the phone, and there was a card sticking out from underneath my box spring, and it was the card for the wrestling school. And so I called him, and he had me come in, and he just kind of, it was just like this ring in this back of this auto body garage, and he kind of broke down what the school is and how long he's been running and all the stuff he's got to do to try to sell me. He goes, "Hey, do you want to get in the ring?" And I got in the ring, and he's like, "Hit the ropes," and I hit the ropes, and I hit the ropes how I was supposed to hit the ropes. So he's like, "Huh." So he let me play around for a second in the ring, which he absolutely should not have done. Uh,
Different time.
but yeah. So he let me play around the ring for a minute, and then I think a week later, maybe I had the money in his hands, and I started training, and just kind of took it from there.
Now, who was this trainer? Because my understanding is that at some point, and I don't know exactly when, because, okay, just for a little inside baseball for people watching, I take a lot of notes, but, a lot of people I interview, they broke in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And the reality is there's not always accurate information. We had a laugh about it. One of the sites listed your first match being in 2002 for Velocity before I think you even ever had a match. So, it just shows the hilarity of how wrong the internet can be sometimes. But
Yep.
I'd like to break down in correct misinformation because it can be hard. There's just a lot of misinformation out there. So when did you actually start training with the great Dory Funk Jr.?
Well, so Dory wasn't the guy that brought me in. The guy that brought me in was a guy named Chris Turner,
Okay.
and he still trains and runs shows in the Jacksonville area now. But he taught me good enough to be good for him, not
Okay.
good enough to be good in the business. I'm not. I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to speak ill of the man, but it could have been way better. I'll just put it that way. The benefit was is that I met three of my closest friends training for him, and we pushed each other. We would be training, other guys would come in and they'd see us and they would leave because we would just in and out, in and out. My birthday when you retrained for 6 hours, that was my birthday present from them. They just stayed in the ring with me.
That's cool.
And but I met Dory at a show in McLeany, Florida, and he uh made me forget I was wrestling. He hit me with a lifter, and he hit me harder than I'd ever been hit at that point. And he was coming off of a hernia surgery. So I wasn't expecting what I got from him.
Yeah.
But he hit me, and I remember looking at the ceiling and just walking backwards. And then I hit the ropes. Oh, man, I'm wrestling. And then we went back into it. And Had him in the corner, hit him with the forearm, tried to, like brother, and then he's like, hit me harder. And I give him, okay, old man. And he's like, hit me, and he shoves me. I was like, all right. And I blasted him. And then he just started firing back. And we got through the match. We didn't call anything because that's how Dory is. And so we got to the back. He goes, thank you very much. I really liked the match.
Wow.
And
Can you imagine hearing that from Dory? That's crazy.
yeah, so I'm trying to not bleed internally at the time. And he's like, hey, I got this school in Ocala, and if you're interested, you can come out and get some workouts in. And I was like, I don't really have money because, you'd heard stories. And I was like, I don't have the money for it. He goes, no, just come and work out. And he just invited me to work out out of the kindness of his heart. And one of my friends that I broke in with was already training there. And he put it over to me. So I went over there and gave it a shot. And I just started working out with them. And I just learned a lot of little things. And then we, from there, we kind of went into helping train people. Mm-hmm. So he like, okay, we got this guy coming from here, this guy coming from here. You guys work with them and break them in, show them the basics. And that kind of my first little, I guess, putting my feet in the water to see how training was. And but it was a cool experience because Coach was so smart, like the way he looked at stuff, and his storytelling was unique, but he would break down why you want to do this and why you don't want to do that. And if you're doing too much, he'd tell you, hey, you're doing too much. Let's make it this way. And, he was of the philosophy of, well, you don't call your matches. You just know what your finish is and you go from there. And it presented challenges to some people, but I just wanted to challenge myself. So I was hungry. So I wrestled him and didn't have to call anything. So he was confident in what I could do. So he was even more confident when I started working with his guys. So I was kind of like a carpenter. And for those that don't know, a carpenter is someone who can work with other people and get them up and give them experience that they need and give them more over so the company can make more money off of them. But that was my first carpentry job, if you will. And but it's crazy. Just I think back on my time around them and just how insightful and how helpful he was, and little things like, Dory wasn't a guy to really get fired up. If anybody's ever seen him, like he wouldn't lose it per se. And I had two instances where he legit like cut me off. Like I was wrestling this kid, and I top a little bit in case you didn't know. And I'm just peppering this kid, and he tries to fight back, and I'm peppering him, right? And the kid starts to give up, and I just hear screaming, fight back, and somebody's banging on the apron, and Coach wasn't out there. So I'm like looking, thinking the fan's getting ready to run in, and it's Coach. And he's like, fight back, and then the kid starts fighting back, but he starts fighting back while I'm looking at Coach. So that was one, and there was another time where middle of a match, and I had a guy sitting on a chair outside of the ring. I was going to run and charge and kick him out of the chair. And I was getting a lot of heat at the time. So I backed up and I turned to run, and Coach was standing there. I don't know where he came from. Like I didn't see him out or whatever. I didn't see him in the crowd, but he was standing there, and he was like in a fighting stance. And I was like, okay, am I going to charge Dory Funk Jr. and get wrecked, or am I going to get back in the ring and live to fight another day? So intelligently, I got back in the ring to fight another day. But he was yelling and screaming and ready to go. And like watching him, he won his first world championship 10 years before I was born. So
yeah,
watching him get excited was a big thing for me, just because I knew of him, and I had watched him all these years growing up or whatever. And I never saw that. So him giving that to me, like it helped me, but two, the crowd knew that it was something serious when he reacted that way. And I don't remember him really doing that with anybody else. But those are just little stuff that he did that you can learn from, and that you knew that was going to pay off in the long run, because it helped me understand heat a little bit more and how to run it and what's going to get something to react off of, and getting people to feel the way that I want them to feel.
What's crazy is he's still going today, like I can't remember who it's with, but he's doing some kind of training camp with somebody locally in Florida. And then he keeps popping up on NXT shows whenever they go to, I can't remember the specific town, but there's one town where he always pops up there. So It's crazy. Did you
Yeah,
ever meet or work with Terry Funk at all? Because obviously they're very different.
I only met Terry in passing once, and I believe I was in California.
Okay.
Uh, but it was real brief. But we actually, Coach and I talked about that, and he was like, "Hey, it's like, how are you and Terry so different?" And Coach was basically just like, he nicely just said that Terry was crazy, and I just I just remember laughing because Coach he'd be like, he goes, "Well," and he just kind of looked down and off like this, and then he would say something, and it'd be a short sentence, but it would tell you everything that you needed to know. And I just kind of like started laughing, and I looked back at him, and he was just giving me a straight face, like letting me like I knew that he was being serious. And I know it's his brother and he loved him, whatever. But it was a funny answer. But I always thought that they were both world champions, and they both carried it similarly but differently in the ring.
Mhm.
Like Dory was very ground, technical, twist, stretch, hook, and Terry could do that, but at the same time, he was way more punch, big sell over the top. And I think
Yeah.
that's what endeared people to Terry is just his personality because there weren't guys like that back then. I mean, Terry in the 80s was selling to similar how the Shawn Michaels would do it in the late 90s.
Oh yeah, you're
Like
right.
big sales, yeah. And the crowd would get sucked into it and everything like that. And he was such a good heel. And when he talked again, you believe it. And he would say random stuff. I found a Wendy's commercial that Terry Funk's in, and they're like, "Would you prefer burger A, B, or C?" And one of them was the Wendy's burger, and they set it up, and it's beautiful and like freshly cooked and everything like that. And one was McDonald's, and one was something else. And Terry chose the McDonald's burger because like one of the little flat cheeseburgers. And he's like, "Why?" He's like, "Because it's hard like my Deltoids." And that was his answer. That was it. And I had to pause it and laugh for like 10 minutes because it was just such a random thing.
It
But
is
like
random.
yeah, and he managed to put his shoulders over talking about why he liked the cheeseburger. And I guess you could say it was the brilliance of Terry Funk.
I love that. And also the Sean and Terry Funk comparison. I never in my life did I ever like put that together. But now that you're saying it, I'm gonna remember it forever because I can totally see what you're talking about. That's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
With in regards to Dory Funk Jr.'s training, you talked about how it was big on calling it stuff in the ring. And do you know roughly, before I ask my question, what year this was in the beginning when you first started? Was it early mid 2000s at that point?
Yeah, probably 2005, six, maybe.
Okay. Because what's so fascinating to me is, by that point, TV wrestling was already taking over, right? Maybe it wasn't as elaborate indie style as you get a lot today, but most things were on television certainly were less calling in the ring and things were starting to get more laid out. Did you find it
Yes.
a detriment, a positive, or maybe a mix of the two that you were being trained so specifically on just calling it out there? Because obviously that's a great art, but if your goal is to end up in a televised company, or if the American indie style, quote unquote, is starting to take over, that's a lot harder to do. So, was that? Do you see that as both a positive, negative?
I think it was a positive.
Okay.
Um, I think that it's good in this sense. Like when I went to the Northeast, it was everybody calls everything. And um, sometimes these guys would fall flat because they didn't necessarily get the crowd because the fans in Philly aren't the same as the fans in New York.
Yeah.
Aren't the same as the fans in Boston. You're going to get different things from different crowds sometimes. And it also depended on the weather or what was going on in the area. Like it just those little things. But it helped because I could read something and then work to it. And a lot of guys coming up now don't necessarily have that luxury. They weren't trained that way. And it's not a shot at them, but like I think that it was better that I had that ability and was able to learn that because like I said, in those situations where something happens on the fly and you got to make the best of it, you're prepared for it.
Were you prepared for the other style at the same time, like, or was that something you found you could adapt to, or did you struggle with the, if you worked the match? I'm not going to throw any names out there because I don't want to, judge anybody. And again, it's not a bad thing, but if you were working with, say, a high flyer guy who did a lot of elaborate spots, you had to call things ahead on, because if you're doing very elaborate spots and sequences, it's got to be called, right? Were you able to click with that right away, or did that take time to develop?
Almost right away.
Cool.
Breaking in, the guy that broke me in didn't teach me a bunch of that stuff, but we were learning the Ring of Honor style, because Ring of Honor had just started. So we were learning that, and we understood that it was a very Japanese influence.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that stuff you couldn't just do on the fly. So I understood that. So we would train that way. We would call a really long spot in training, and then we would run it. And then the next person would get in, not having called it, but just seen it. We try to run it again. So by the time I got to where I was working the bigger indies and working with high flyers and stuff, it was something easy for me to adapt to. So it was the way that I trained lended itself to me being successful in that avenue.
That's super cool. It's good that you got kind of a best of both worlds approach in that regard. Now, I appreciate your time. You've been a great guest. I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions to get you on out of here, because as you can tell, we haven't even gotten to your first match yet, and we've been talking for an hour, so you can see how this interview kind of goes. But I appreciate all the in-depth answers. I really enjoy it. I did want to ask about the Florida wrestling scene in the era of when you were breaking in, because the indies have gone, their ups and downs, but really the indies started, I guess, first taking off in, the early to mid 2000s with Ring of Honor, as you mentioned, exploding TNA. By the time you were breaking into wrestling, what did the Florida indie scene look like, and how has it evolved or not evolved in that time?
So when I first broke in, I didn't know much about the Florida indie scene, just because it was so localized as far as where I was training, and he wasn't one of those guys that wanted you to go and learn all this other stuff. But I had television, and we had the Sunshine Network, and we'd be able to watch these other independents in the area. And I would go to WWE shows, and the Florida guys would kind of be there. The guys like Billy Fives, Black Nature Boy, Scoot Andrews, Mike Sullivan, Steve Madison, Buck Quatermain. Like, all these guys were doing enhancement stuff and getting sometimes longer segments in TV. And so I kind of started paying attention to some of those companies. Now, once I started doing them, the actual Florida indies, you could work Florida indies every weekend and not hit the same town for a month or two. And there was so much talent. There was Roddy Strong, Cedric Strong, Eric Stevens, Bruce Santee, Jarrell Clark, Kenny King, Scott and Phil Davis, Fordell Walker. I mean, there's so much talent, and everybody. It was a point of pride for Florida guys to be able to go anywhere. Like, Scoot was a Ring of Honor guy, and we all just kind of followed that lead. We wanted to be able to say, okay, well, we're from Florida, but we can run with New York, we can run with Texas, we can run with California. And so we all worked that way. And a lot of those guys were very accommodating and very, very open with their knowledge. They wouldn't just get a match out of you and then go on about their business. And they would also test you. I had a very bad high ankle sprain one time, and I was working with Billy Fives, who for a long time, my gear was half one color and half another color. And that was an ode to Billy, because that's how his gear used to be. And he didn't even know it until I told him before our match. But I had a really bad ankle sprain. I was like, hey, watch this ankle. I got a sprain. It's bruised all the way up, almost up to my knee. He goes, okay, no problem. First thing he did was go after that ankle. And he just wanted to see what I would do. And Billy was a legit guy. So he didn't have to worry about me trying to attack him, because he was a beast on the mat. So he just wanted to see how I'd go with it. And I just sold it, and we worked back into it. And he said, hey, good job, kid. And then we just kept going. But that was the thing. Like, you had to earn your acceptance into the Florida Indies. You could wrestle the shows, but there was different levels of shows. And if you didn't prove to the guys on top that you belonged on top with them, then you wouldn't move up the card. And that's just how it was. But it made everybody better for it.
As a trainer now, if you were coaching one of your students and, they found themselves in a similar situation as what you just described, where, they're going into a match, maybe hurt, whether they should or shouldn't, that's a different discussion. and they ask somebody, hey, watch it, and they end up going after it like that. Again, not necessarily maliciously, of course, but how would you advise them? What would you suggest they do?
To remember that it's professional wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like somebody's trying to take advantage of you and hurt you, whole nother story.
Yeah.
But if you realize that they're just testing you, then pass the test.
Mm-hmm.
As far as this business has come along, there's still some very old ways that still prevail in certain areas. And they're going to want to see how you react. And sometimes it's not even in a match. Sometimes it's just in the locker room with the way somebody talks to you or what somebody says to you or what they ask you to do. They want to see how you're going to react. And you have to have the presence of mind to understand when you're being tested and to understand when you're being disrespected. As long as you feel like it's not disrespect, like I said, pass the test. Do what they ask you to do. As long as it's not degrading or humiliating or whatever, keep your self-respect first and foremost over everything. But sometimes they're just going to test you to see what you do. And I think that that's a thing that not enough guys understand. They're like, oh, well, he's picking on me. No, he's not. He just wants to see what you're going to do. And guess what? That happens at TV. That happens at the bigger indies. That happens in Japan. They're going to test you to see what you do so they know what kind of person they're dealing with. Because a lot of times they don't know you. So you're coming in, you're trying to make a name for yourself, or you're trying to get into these circles to where you can make more money and do better business. They got to see what kind of business person you are. Are you going to be able to handle some light ribbing? Are you going to be able to handle if somebody seems like they're doing something or they're just messing with you in a match? How do you react to that? And most times, like I said, as long as it's not degrading and they're not hurting you for their gain, then you fight through it and then you're better because of it. There's more money on the back end of that. And I'm not one for, I wouldn't do that. If somebody told me that they had an injury, I wouldn't go after it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I understood what Billy was doing. I just saw him Wednesday and he came up and he shook my hand and he was like, man, it's good to see how far you've come and da-da-da. And he went back to that moment in our match and we just kind of had a quick laugh about it. But that was him letting me know, like, okay, this is kind of what I was doing. I wanted to see what you had so I could feel comfortable leaving this part of the business to you and guys like you, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to throw one more question your way, then we'll get to the last question and the plugs. But I was curious, at this point in time, when you were first breaking in and then your early years, what were your goals and aspirations in wrestling? Because, some people are like, oh, I want to be on TV. I want to go to Japan. I just want to wrestle. I just want to have a match. It varies from person to person. What were yours initially and how did that evolve?
I wanted to make money. But I wanted to learn. I've never had a job where I just sat comfortably and spun my wheels. If I can't get better and I can't help make the company or the job better, then I don't want to be there. And I've been lucky enough to be consistently challenged in wrestling to where I have to learn this type of style, or, oh, you got to wrestle with this guy that's from Japan that doesn't speak any English, or you got to do this, or you got to do that. Getting in, I wanted to make money and learn. And I've never stopped wanting to do either, obviously. But then as I got more experience and I heard other guys' stories and I saw the way some of the young guys were treated or the way some of the young guys were trained, it kind of became ingrained in me to leave it better than I found it. I want to walk away from wrestling when my final match happens and that bell rings and I take my boots off for the last time. I want to know that I did enough to help enough people. And it doesn't have to be big. I'm not looking for pats on the back. I don't want people to be like, oh, well, Jon Davis did this for me or Jon Davis did this for me. And anybody that you talk to that I've actually been able to help and they say thank you, I tell them, thank me with success. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for you. I want the business to be better because if I can help you and then you can become a bigger deal or you get on TV and you take a little bit of your time and you help somebody else come up, then they get better. and it grows the business and it helps everybody and the business makes more money. And I want all the boys to be as good as humanly possible. So that's where the Leave It Better Than You Found It comes from. I genuinely care about the sport of professional wrestling and the wrestlers involved in it, no matter their talent level. I'll take my time out and give advice to people who I don't know, never met first match. I'll take advice and go to a different, if I'm in a different area, if I go to New York and these kids don't know me, hey, this is what I saw. And a lot of times they're like, okay. And then somebody tells them who I am and they're like, oh, okay. And then they want to listen to me. But that's probably my mission statement now. Even before I was an actual coach, I was coaching. I was doing seminars. I was talking to guys. A ton of people have my phone number and they just text me, hey, can you watch this match for me? Or, hey, how should I attack this promo? Or, hey, what did you think of this? And that to me is as good as having a 5-star match somewhere at this point in my career, because I want to be able to give back and I want those kids to take that with them where they go, and then want them to give back to somebody else.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And the last question before we hit plugs, if I'm lucky enough to talk to you again in the future and do another interview, I'm going to ask you the same question at the end, because in my opinion, the answer can change. What does the future look like for Jon Davis?
I'm going to grow older as gracefully as I can. I really want to grow the coaching. I want to grow the school. I feel like I am fit to be a coach, and a lot of people have hit me up and like, hey, this is your thing. And I'm modest about it. I mean, I don't know the most. I haven't had the most experience. I'm, in my opinion, an average guy, but I try to help these kids get better. And we've got a pretty solid crop right now. And they all have heart and they all fight through it every single workout. I don't know if you've seen any of those videos, but the mats are covered in sweat. They're grunting, they're sore, they're bruised up, but we're training to be the best that we can be. And so I think my future is I'm going to wrestle as long as I'm physically able to. I'm not going to be the guy that's like, okay, if I get to a point where I feel like I can't do it, I'm just not going to do it. Mm-hmm. There's no point in me going out there and taking somebody else's space and not being able to let them move up. Again, it's leaving it better than you found it. So I need to understand when it's time for me to hang them up. And I don't feel like I'm there. I was just doing rolls and stuff this morning. So I can still do that. I still understand it. So I think I can still get a few good matches here and there if people will have me. But it's really just teaching these kids. And if I'm at shows, helping kids there and continuing again to make everybody reach their potential. I don't want to give myself credit for it, but I want these guys to get as good as they possibly can. And if I can be but a small part of it, then I'm doing what I want to do.
In regards to that, Tom, when we talked, he said, hopefully, and of course, this is in the distant future, once you guys have more training under your belt, he would love to transition to, in addition to training, putting on shows so students have places to work where they can get better and they can work on their craft. Is that something that personally you're excited for? Because promoting is a whole different animal, of course.
Well, I mean, I've helped promote shows before. I've booked before. I've agented. I've produced. I've got a lot of those things under my belt just from experience and trying to help. I would love if we were able to run shows so these kids can get experience. I don't care about bringing big names in and all the other stuff. Let's build what we have here. Florida, North Florida specifically, has had a lot of talent that's kind of just been in North Florida. And I got lucky in the sense that I got to travel and that I had the mindset to travel and move around. But it would be nice to show everybody what we're getting out of these kids. And we kind of have some stuff in the works now to where we're going to get them on some shows around here once they're ready. Mm-hmm. They have to prove to us that they're ready. But once they're there, we're going to start getting them on shows. And if we could run a few shows or run something consistently, I would love that because it helps showcase what we're doing here. And we have enough connections where we can get people to see it and hopefully get these kids booking so they can start running in other places.
And that's kind of the brilliance of the school, right? You have 3 guys, 3 veterans who have kind of done basically everything there is in different avenues of wrestling, from, Ring of Honor, TNA, WWE, and basically everything in between the National Wrestling Alliance. There's connections now, there's connections from the past, and so much experience. So I think Hatchet Pro Wrestling is going to have a bright future. I think it's super cool that you guys are doing it. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and talk about the school. Before we let you go, where can people check you out?
USWA, We Are Wrestling, Viral Pro Wrestling. Those are my next 3 upcoming things. I try to bounce around at this point. It's not necessarily of getting on the biggest show I possibly can, but I like just going and working with anybody I can to help get kids up at this point. I don't think I'm needed at some places. Of course, I'll go if they have me, but again, it's just making everything, helping other guys get better, to get them the confidence to try to move up and have bigger matches at different places. But also just check me out on social medias, follow the Hatchet. And I guess that's about it.
And we will have links again, guys, in the description for every, for your personal social media. We'll have Hatchet Pro information as well. So you guys can click there, show some support. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at Armbars Sidebar, on YouTube at Armbars and Sidebars. Be sure to subscribe, throw a like up on the videos that you watch, and on Instagram at Armbars and Sidebars. We're also on Threads. We're trying to do the Threads thing. I don't know if Threads is still taking off or not, but we're on the Threads. So at Armbars and Sidebars, follow us there too. Jon, sir, thank you so much for joining us. It was a delightful chat. I hope to have you back in the future, and I really enjoyed your insight. Thank you so much.
Real fast before you go. Let me thank you. This isn't like I'm being gracious thing. I really mean this. I've done a lot of podcasts in my career. I've talked to a lot of people in my career, and I appreciate your interest in me over my matches and accomplishments. And we don't get that enough. And if the other boys haven't told you, it's appreciated. So thank you for doing what you do.
Well, that's an honor to hear from you. Thank you so much. And I can't possibly say anything to match that. So thank you so much. And until next time, guys, later.